There we go. Okay, welcome everybody. It's 9:03 in Iceland. It's 4:03 in New York time. Welcome everybody to Boroughs and Burbs. This week on our show, we have Dr. Rob Docters, and he is a Yale professor and a consultant and a author of four books. And we're going to be talking just three. Okay, well, don't rush you, right? 3 books, including the upcoming, and I guess it's going to be coming out in May, but you can pre-order it on Amazon, and it's called Ethics and Hidden Greed. And I thought that was an excellent topic for today's show with realtors and people in real estate, ethics and hidden greed, because we're arguing about ethics every day in the real estate business. So with that, welcome, and we can't wait to hear about the new book. Why don't you begin and tell us why you decided to write a book on ethics and hidden greed?
Thank you, John. It actually occurred to me over breakfast that I had with a lady who's CEO of almost $1 billion corporation. And we were talking about fraud. And she said, which is interesting, because she's a really smart woman, she said, I feel like I've been taken advantage of many times, but I'm not sure when. So it struck me that most people are unwitting victims of greed, and maybe increasingly so. So as I thought further about that, 2 other things came up. One was, why is that? And then secondly, how do you know that something is unethical, that something is greedy? And so I did a bit of research, and I discovered there was an interesting guy called Professor Henry Moore, who was a professor at Cambridge University in UK. Apparently a very modest and nice guy. He turned down being president of his college. He was just, in general, a very modest individual. But he wrote a great book in 1667 on ethics. And he laid out in very clear terms that you don't see these days what was ethical and what was not. And so then I used that as the touchstone. And then I looked at various practices in various industries, touching upon real estate, and said, well, let's see how they compare to the ethical rules. And in many cases, there were some clear violations, but, they weren't the old violations like you had hundreds of years ago. There were new and more sophisticated forms of violations.
He was an absolutist, or would he have allowed for some cases of situational ethics where the ends justify the means?
Well, I think the answer is that, and it's like anything else in ethics, it's not that simple, but the answer is, I think he would call himself an absolutist. And in fact, might even challenge the phrase, the ends justify the means. Because in some cases, doing something that is not something you feel comfortable with is necessary for a greater good later on. And he actually says in one of his rules that if you need to do something in the short term that avoids a greater evil later on, that's okay. So
can we just start from like on a macro level of kind of defining greed and defining unethical behavior, and are they mutually exclusive of one another?
Because we're in a business that is highly regulated, and banking, the people who write the mortgages, highly regulated. So we just point to the rules and we say, I don't have to be ethical. I just have to follow the rules, right? So what does it mean to be greedy when I'm following the rules?
Well, the rules don't cover everything. Speaking as a lawyer, there are a lot of spaces between the rules. And a good example is this. There's no rule against the following, but it's something I understand happens. When you have a new house, so this applies less to old houses, maybe ones that have been restored, but nonetheless, with new houses, builders know that what's going to happen is after they built the house, the soon-to-be owner will march through, and particularly if it's a male, he will want to show what a savvy buyer he is. So he'll march through the house and he'll be looking for something and say, you did that wrong, fix it. Well, yeah, but who needs that? So what a lot of builders do, not saying all by any means, but a lot of them do, is they give him something to find. And apparently a favorite something to find is that apparently it's fairly easy, I'm not a builder, but it's fairly easy to align a windowsill that's out of true. So what they do is they have one conspicuous windowsill that's out of true. So, you know, Mr. I'm proving my point will march through and said, ah, windowsill out of true. And look at, oh, and then we'll fix it, sir. And then next time it comes back, it's been fixed. Apparently it's really easy to fix it. You can make those windows horizontal. And then that way he doesn't discover that, you know, something horrible happened with regard to the, you know, air conditioning ducts or whatever, what could have gone possibly much more seriously wrong. So the answer is they create a solution, and I don't think the law ever touches that.
Because we can
You
go
would
back,
consider-
go back to defining greed, first of all. Let's
Yeah,
just
is that
define
greedy?
It's
Yeah,
greed.
is that
because
greedy?
that's the thing. Is it unethical behavior or is that greedy? And is greed necessarily bad?
Thank you, Michael Douglas.
You know, exactly. But no, but I mean, it's truly because people have different values and people need different things. So something in an exchange, it may be seem greedy to one side where it's absolutely not on the other.
Well, I mean, almost every dictionary has roughly the same definition of greed, which is excessive wanting. What's interesting is I don't think that's a very good definition. I think greed, in the way that most people use it, is not only an excessive wanting, it's a willingness to use bad tactics to get it. And what Professor Moore said in 1667 was that there are ways in which you can achieve something, you can get something, and there's things you want that are simply wrong. And then he actually says, and if you obtain your goods that way, your wealth, it's forfeit. You shouldn't have it. So, for instance, one of the things that just two parallel examples. An example of excessive wanting is an artist who wants to do the best painting he can. There's absolutely nothing unethical about it. The fact that, you know, for instance, what's his name? The guy who painted the Sistine Chapel, that he actually, yes, he actually damaged his eyesight while he was doing it. He was that intensive about making this the best he could do. On the other hand, you have Bernie Madoff. He's very intent about making more money. The difference between these two individuals, both of whom were successful in their own fields, is that Bernie was willing to cheat. He would do things to people that he wouldn't want done to himself. He lied. He did several things that were all wrong, according to Professor Moore. By the way, apropos of being truthful, Moore put it very nicely. He said, when you lie, you are creating a bad spirit that goes out through the world. And that's one of the reasons why I think lying, most people don't realize, is bad, because it has ripple effects. It's like throwing a stone in a pond. So I don't know, Roberto, does that answer your question?
It does. And for example, it's all very murky, right? Because it's about interpretation. In some cases, it's about interpretation. For example, who's the guy who won the Tour de France, however many times? He justified what he did because for the great benefit of an enormous group of people. But his methods and what he did were very unethical. And is it greedy that did he get something he wasn't supposed to have? Were his ethics in conflict with the other people's? And therefore, does that make it who's right, who's wrong? And I'm not saying he's right by any means. I think it was, but it could be argued and interpreted in a certain way, like by himself.
Yeah,
I think we're using things that are illegal as a crutch. I think talking about the Tour de France, they prosecuted him. Bernie Madoff, they prosecuted him. I don't think we necessarily have to break the law in order to be unethical. I think the line before being unethical is way before we become, caught and thrown in jail or fined. Last week, I wanted to raise this question with you. Last week, there was a story in the paper about a guy who stole from one of the crypto exchanges, Mango Crypto Exchange. And his lawyer said that the rules are different in the crypto space, in the software space, and that it is expected that somebody will test the system, probe the system, and try and find weakness in the system, and that they look forward to their day in court. This is a guy who stole $100 million. He offered to give most of it back once he got caught. But his explanation was, this is the new normal for the software industry and crypto in particular. He's making an ethical argument to try and get out of jail, that the rules are different in the crypto space. So it seems to me that we're leaning too much on what's legal and what's not legal, and we've forgotten what's ethical and what's greedy.
Couldn't agree more. And I think that, well, the lawyer may not have bothered learning that, but most ethicists are perfectly happy to say, yes, law and ethics are orthogonal. There's a lot of stuff that's illegal. For instance, parking in the wrong place, speeding in the highway, failing to renew your license on time. Those are all illegal. They're not immoral at all. They're not unethical at all. Conversely, as you just observed, there's a lot of stuff that's unethical, and it may be decades before the law finally gets around to reflecting it, if it ever does. So, we have to have this inner compass of what's allowable and what's not. And that inner compass doesn't have its pivot in Hartford or in Washington or wherever the laws should be coming from.
In a negotiation, does someone always win and lose? How do you find that exact, unless you have this utopian place or this, and you literally are finding the exact middle, someone wins, someone loses, right?
Right.
Okay.
Well, just to say it, that's okay. In fact, it can actually be okay to win more than you should. And let me give you an example. There are certain birth controls like Mirena and a bunch of other ones offered actually mainly by Bayer Health Care. And they are part of what health networks, such as United Health or whatever, offer. What I did some work as a consultant with Bayer, and it was the funniest opening to an assignment I've ever had, which was the chairman was sitting there and he said, we've been raising our price every year, first by 20%, then 40%, then 60, then we doubled it, et cetera. And nobody seems to notice or care. And he was puzzled. How can it be that there's no price resistance? And the answer is, for most healthcare networks, they offer thousands of drugs and thousands of treatments, of which Bayer Healthcare's birth control is only one of them. They can't drop that because that's an important drug and a regularly used drug by many women. So when they double the price, what the healthcare network does is they look to take some money away from somebody else, because they can't just raise the prices infinitely, because then they can no longer compete with other healthcare networks. So that's an example where if they don't, if the healthcare network loses that negotiation, the Bayer, shame on them, but they can, and it doesn't seem to hurt them or Bayer. It hurts some third party, often not even identified at the time. I actually believe that network has an obligation to some of its other suppliers to not suddenly start crunching them. You know, you have an obligation to make sure that third parties are not harmed by what they do. And I will tell you that most of the healthcare networks are terrible negotiators. I've helped a dozen companies while I was with Abbey Road and Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey do their negotiations. And left to their own devices, many of them do not do the proper prep for their negotiations. Example, there was a case in Japan where BCG helped this particular drug provider. And we came in and for the first time asked everybody to develop a profile of every decision maker in the government that allowed different prices. And then we practiced the negotiation. We did mock negotiations. And in short, we did an elaborate prep for the war that was going to happen between this drug provider and the Japanese government. And it was a huge success. They had the highest initial price of any drug in that category had ever had. And it's because they worked hard at it. And I claim that that's actually ethical. It's not unethical. They were representing themselves and they did do so properly. The government, by the way, was the ones who were asleep at the switch. They should have stood up and said, no, I'm going to negotiate harder. So I would suggest it's a question of, are you doing what your duty requires you to do? Does that make sense?
All right, I have some real estate questions for you. In the real estate business, all we have is our reputation, and a reputation for being smart and hardworking is part of it. But having integrity is a big part of what helps me win business or lose business. And the way people find out whether I have integrity is they go up and they read my reviews. Every person on here has either gotten a poor review on Google or on Zillow at some point, or will at some point get a poor review. And there's nothing worse, because once you start to investigate, you start to realize there's nothing I can do about it. And you say, it's not fair. I'm ethical. I'm not greedy. I played by the rules. This is not fair. Somebody can damage my reputation and my business, and I need to do something about it. And you start to reach out and you say, well, can I hire somebody to clear off this bad review? I mean, and I've seen all the threads where people do the research to see, can I get rid of it? And usually the answer is no, you can't. So I know Professor Moore in 1665 didn't have the benefit of having Google reviews and Zillow reviews to contend with, but if he were around today, what's the answer? Because right now we rely on background check to see if you've been arrested. And then the next thing we do is we Google somebody to see if they're trustworthy, and we can put them into a rental, or we can rely on their offer to buy the house. And likewise, they're Googling us to see whether we are, in fact, have integrity. So where's the line in a society that's hyper-focused on reputational reviews online?
Well, first of all, that there is an endemic problem with social media and other similar tools. Somebody once commented, they said, lies are gone halfway around the world while truth is still putting on its boots. It's just slower to get the truth out. Part of the problem, of course, is, the government has made it difficult to actually say, hey, this is wrong. I'm about to sue you. Defamation is a perfectly legitimate tool. It's just it's made hard to do. And in fact, the government has made it very hard to sue major social media platforms. They recently reconsidered that, but in the end, they concluded that they were still going to allow the shields from defamation. And they do that from time to time. I mean, the other favorite all time is they just, with a little bit of help from the lobbyists, they decided that they would limit the liability from nuclear power reactors. So even if they're sloppy and they blow up half of Pennsylvania, can't sue them, thanks to our government. That is wrong. And I claim that's a manifestation of evil getting around an obstacle. And they do that with frequency. I think I mentioned to you the example of suntan lotion. So here you were an incumbent suntan lotion maker, and suddenly you notice that there are new people selling it. And even though it doesn't cost much to make, they're selling it at much lower prices than you do. So you could meet their prices, or you could go to the government and say, hey, I want you to officially say there's only 5 ingredients that are permissible in a suntan lotion. And anyone who calls himself suntan lotion or sunblock that doesn't have exactly those 5 ingredients, and by the way, we happen to have a patent on those 5 ingredients, you, the FDA, must go and beat on their door. So instead of you doing the hard work, you've now gotten the government to do the dirty work. I should mention, as a way of context, the European Union allows 22 ingredients to be called suntan lotion. So this isn't that there's some magic to the 5, it's just the lobbyists of some incumbent drug companies were very good.
But I think that comes from a fact that the deck is stacked against us. I feel that if the deck is stacked against me with poor reviews, then I'm entitled to fight back. And I feel like that company may feel that suddenly there's new players, new competition. Suddenly, it's not a level playing field. It's not fair, and many times the response, and in this case lobbying, is to try and, in the perception of the aggrieved, is to right the playing field. So, is it really everybody takes their ethics and says, I'm being ethical as long as I'm playing on a level playing field. And if I'm not playing on a level playing field, if others in financial sector are insider trading, if in real estate, others are self-dealing, basically holding their pocket listings and trying to sell to their own customers instead of allowing the entire market to participate. So in each of these cases, you start to see that people are trying, through what you'd call greedy and unethical behavior, just trying to re-level the playing field. Is that allowed in ethics, in discussions of ethics? Am I allowed to say, well, I've been aggrieved and I'm just trying to get it back to level?
Well, who knows whether it's level or not? I mean, but the point is that the one thing that people don't realize is that it's perfectly ethical to fight back. I wish I had a real estate example, but let me give you the following example. One of the leading tax authorities was selling its particular product, and it looked roughly a lot like the chief competitor's product, so there wasn't that much difference. Suddenly, the competitor started going to that company's, the first company's best clients and saying, hey, I'll sell you it for half price. So suddenly, this company found that some of its best clients were defecting because they've been offered this spectacular low price. And they didn't like that. And they couldn't do much about it until they realized you can be proactive. So what they started doing was going to the attacking company's best clients and saying, dear company X, you're paying $100 for this. Do you realize that your wonderful provider has been offering it for $50 to other companies? Well, that created a storm, and very soon that second company could no longer make those kinds of off-price deals. But you had to know that it's part of there is an ethical rule that you not only can't lie, but you have to be candid. You have to speak up. So if there's some way that you can react to these people posting these reviews, and I just don't know enough about the particulars to say how, but if you post something about saying Rob Docters is a liar and here's what he said and here's why it's not true, that should have an impact.
But a lot of what you're basing everything on is the agreement that we all understand something to be like factual. For example, John said to level the playing field, and then you said, well, is it level or not? Who knows? We would have to agree whether that's, it's like right now they're doing this show on CNN or something with Giuliani, and they have this thing, he says, the truth isn't the truth. And then someone else comes in and says, truth is perception. And we are all now dealing with facts aren't facts. We have people who believe in alternative facts and they view certain things in a different way. So therefore, we're not playing just that alone. Our perceptions are different. So our ethics can also be different coming at a certain problem or a certain transaction. So I think that in many of these cases you have, whereas we want to make it like that's unethical fact, it's like binomial. It's either is or it's not. You're pregnant or you're not. Black and white. It's just not ever going to be. And I'm just wondering, is there, for example, is there greed? Is there some level of greed in every single transaction? I think there is.
Well, I suspect, humans being humans, there's self-deception in every transaction. But that being said, I think the standard is not perfection. It is a good effort. It is a fair approach. So yeah, maybe when you tell, someone, gosh, your price should be higher by 10% or lower than 10%, you may be forgetting the fact that he built a beautiful marble fountain in the backyard, and that should have propelled it up. Or they've discovered that 20 years ago there was a fuel tank there that leaked a little bit, and that got covered up. It could be that those are impacting what the price should be, but as long as you are candid, in other words, you don't have to dig up the person's yard to find out if there is in fact a fuel leak there, and you don't have to present accounting data on how much the fountain cost, but you must give it that candid, honest approach.
I think it's interesting that you bring up fuel tanks, because we in Connecticut deal with that all the time, and it's just part of the broader discussion of disclosures. Our industry has basically made it really easy for us by saying you are required to disclose these things and you are not to disclose any of those things. And they make us take a test on it. And then they say, okay, those are the rules and you don't have any responsibility. You must disclose and you must not disclose. And you work for the buyer or you work for the seller and you must disclose that as well. So they've pretty much taken out all the guesswork out of a question of ethics for realtors, or so it would seem.
Well, I think, yeah, but you pointed it out earlier. Law and ethics are not overlapping totally. It could be that there are situations where there is something that you're not required by law to present it, but you are required by ethics to be candid about it, to disclose. And that will not be an easy task to swallow. And I could easily believe.
No, in my business, I'm not allowed to tell you that the house is haunted. I'm not allowed to.
Well, that would be an example of an unethical law, I think. So that isn't John's problem, but it is Hartford's problem. I mean, governments are clearly not always ethical. Back in the days, I actually made money as a lawyer We had a client that came to us, and they owned about 500 miles of track, a little bit north of Houston. And the government of Texas came by and they were building a road. So they, by eminent domain, seized 40 yards of track and said, all right, 40 yards of track, that's $30,000. Here you are. And of course, our client didn't accept that, because without that 40 yards in the middle, the extra 400 miles of track were worthless. And we sued and we won. So that was an example of where, just because the government says something is ethical, it wasn't. I'm sorry, you were about to say something?
No, I was just bringing up, like, let's say that you're a realtor and you walk into a prospective client, you're making a sale, and you go to a client's house and you look down in the basement and you're like, boy, it kind of looks like you've had a little flood here. And the person goes, nope, no flood. And you're like, but there's watermarks up here and you have soaking boxes. They go, nope, no flood. So is it ethical for you to go ahead and accept their disclosure that you're sitting there going, I don't think this is right?
That would be unethical.
That actually happened to me. My client, a New York lawyer, took the disclosures and wrote no water problem in the basement. And the buyer did I guess some sort of a title search, or I don't know what kind of a search he did, but he came back and he said, you claimed $75,000 worth of damage in a basement flood. And client said, yeah, no problem. I had a flood, fixed it, no problem. So I just checked the no problem box. And I thought, wow, $75,000 with a basement problem, and you just checked the no problem anymore box. It was his interpretation, I guess, of the disclosure forms. And I guess Connecticut allows you to interpret according to each of our own ethics. And I guess that's a problem.
Truth is perception. So the similar situation that Scott's talking about, you have an owner, you represent an owner, you have a bidding war on something. So let's say it's $1 million. You have 4 or 5 offers. You go to a best and final, and someone comes in and they put an offer in of, like, they blow everybody out of the water, and they offer almost 1-2. And they're definitely the top person. They're going to get it hands down. The next person is like 1-5,000, right? They've blown them out. Seller says, it's great. Go back to them and say, our seller would like to, accept your offer, but if you could pay X more, or you could do this, or you could do that, he'll probably accept your offer. I want you to go back and tell him that. Is it ethical?
Absolutely. I mean, you're in a negotiation, you're allowed to tell each other, or signal to each other, say to each other, what you're expecting to do. By the way, they may be lying, but that would be wrong. But it isn't your problem as a realtor. You're not supposed, you don't have to read their minds.
What if in that same bidding war, somebody drops out and you don't tell the person who keeps on, who thinks that he's still in a bidding war and is behaving as such?
Yeah, ethics is not being stupid, but however, being honest and truthful. And like the bidding war scenario, my son just got a great deal on an apartment in Brooklyn. Things were awesome. It was great. He happens to work for a law firm, and his boss said, no, you got to go back for another bite at the apple. And they went back for another bite at the apple, and the landlords we're out, we're done. And they walked away, and the apartment's now empty. And my son's now going to get an inferior apartment, probably for more money. And that's an example of where greed and the ethics of, we had a deal and now you're trying to retrade the deal, it didn't work out that well. And so I think he learned an important lesson there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think his boss at the law firm suffers from one of the big drivers of lack of ethics and greed. It's narcissism. There's this very clear link between people, how they view themselves as the center of the world, and their actions. And that is squarely unethical because, as mentioned, Professor Moore makes it clear that you are responsible for the consequences of your action. And there's lots of evidence actually, and there's a big debate about whether wealth drives narcissism or narcissism drives wealth. The bulk of the evidence, in my opinion, is that actually narcissism is somewhat independent of wealth, but often related. What you have is you have narcissists who's, and we can think of a very recent president who probably falls into that category, who believe that everything must be as they say it is. And they feel morally outraged if it's not. On the other hand, that's they're the more reasonable people in the world. Unfortunately, you sometimes have to go outside of, and you're not dealing with them all the time, would say, no, this appears to be a reasonable truth, and this is my counter truth. We'll see who wins out.
Since you brought him up, I'm going to continue on that, using that example. You're talking about Trump, and one of the arguments he's made, when asked about his tax returns were, I am playing by the rules. I am playing within the law. So my question, therefore, is, are we as a society getting further away from an understanding of what is ethical because we are increasingly dependent on asking the government and the law to tell us where the line is? In the case of Trump, he says, it's legal, so therefore I did it. As we've gotten more and more sophisticated in a law-driven society, people like Trump are saying it doesn't matter if it's ethical, it's legal. Are we as a society moving in that direction? Is your research show that we're becoming less ethical as a society, that there are more people making that argument than perhaps 50 years ago or 100 years ago?
Unfortunately, yes. I mean, for instance, Richard Nixon, one of the reasons he actually had to leave office was not purely that the burglars invaded the Watergate. There was a pretty good case made. He had cheated to the tune of $700,000 on his taxes. And it wasn't that anybody had sued him on that. It just came out in the press, and that was the investigation. Trump has had that repeatedly. And whereas it eroded Nixon's support and voter base, it doesn't seem to have had much impact on Trump's base and his political support. The fact that, he and his father conspired to transfer wealth from Trump Sr. to Donald without having to pay taxes on it. There's a dozen things that he's done that's come out. New York Times has been quite ferocious on following that, and doesn't seem to have affected his base. There's a funny thing about that. There was an interview with a psychologist who deals with that sort of thing, and he says that many people, when they hear something about someone they like, and they get any kind of a denial, what they ask themselves is, could it be true? Not is it true, but could it be true? And if the answer is that it could be true, then they'll say, okay, I can accept that, because they're not interested in distilling the absolute truth. They're interested in moving ahead and getting whatever they want done.
Pete, you have something to say?
I'm sorry?
Pete, can you unmute Pete? I think Pete was.
Yeah. So there's two things I want to add to this. One is that it's interesting because I think we've moved from this culture where we used to debate ideas, but we had common facts. And now we no longer have common facts and no longer similar ideas. So that's what you're all saying. I mean, that's what this comes down to. The second part of it is that, and I wrote this earlier, is when you get people that become unethical, are unethical people attracted to roles where they can kind of game the system a little bit? And, I'd go back to the academic question, go back to like Zimbardo and the Stanford experiment. The way they recruited the people for the experiment was, do you want to be a prison guard or do you want to be a prisoner? So there was sort of a setup in that attracted people that were potentially less than ethical. So, you begin to wonder, you talk about Madoff. Was Madoff in that, could Madoff have been a psychologist? Probably not. He wanted to make money. And he was in a business where it was very easy to, kite accounts and string people along. So that, I just wonder if that's part of what the conversation is.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that what happens to a lot of wealthy people is they basically say what I do is right, ipso facto. I mean, if with the other interesting example, of course, was what's her name? The cooking lady from Westport.
Martha Stewart.
Yes. What's interesting is after she had become a billionaire is when she ran into trouble with, $100,000, which, I would notice, but, she was a billionaire. Her company went public for 1.9 billion.
It was after she was a billionaire that she got caught. I doubt that one day we wake up and suddenly do an unethical thing. It probably.
But the point was she was tempted to do it. That was not a rational thing. And I think I told you the wonderful example of the candy jar. For everyone else's benefit, there's a wonderful case where people were divided up into wealthy and not wealthy people. They were ushered into a room on the way to a meeting, and there was a big candy jar full of candies. And they were told, this candy jar will be for some children who are coming through later. Only take one candy. So the average income and the less wealthy people rolled through, and indeed they took one candy. Then the wealthier people rolled through, and suddenly, there were multiple candies being taken by everyone. And that was because they felt entitled.
Can we just meander just a little bit, because we were talking in your book, you talk about the effect of AI, and we're coming into an age where it is exploding, and there's a lot of questions about ChatGPT, ethical. Can you talk about that a bit as to where you think this is going, and it's kind of warping our realities in a way that is becoming more complicated to identify, unethical behavior, greed, etc. And also these machines are running and thinking way exponential, like 60-some thousand times faster than any human could. So we're trying to play catch up with something that is, you said, what did you say? A lie goes around the world 50 or 60 times before, it's the same idea. Can you just chat about that a bit?
Well, I mean, for instance, partially what seems relevant to what you just said is artificial intelligence. And a lot of people are very scared of artificial intelligence, or at least they claim to be. Elon Musk, who we may or may not admire, said, but was clearly a good technologist, said, oh yes, AI is more dangerous to humans than atomic bombs. Well, maybe. I mean, I actually view it a little bit more like a glorified filing cabinet in a way, but without getting into the argument over AI, the point is, AI, can do some things that are bad. They can track the behavior of thousands of social media users. It has been used to break into hundreds of thousands of Twitter accounts. It has been used in some cases to break into secure financial deposits. It is clearly a dangerous thing. On the other hand, AI is now increasingly being used to help surgeons. Apparently, AI can help a surgeon figure out what's going wrong, or if anything's going wrong, or what needs to be done in elaborate surgeries like heart surgery. So it's got pluses and its minuses. I would suggest this is nothing new. This is there was a time, a machine gun was considered, the ultimate weapon, very dangerous. And people went around saying, oh no, there should never be a machine gun. That being said, what's turned out is that in order to combat the gangsters in Chicago, the Chicago police had to use machine guns. So both of these have both sides to it. And we just need to be able to recognize which is which and block the evil use. Does that respond to your question?
How do we
Yeah.
train? How do we train ethics? How do we train our kids to be more ethical? How do we train our realtors to be more ethical? Because they sure try. I mean, a good deal of the questions on the realtor exam are related to ethics. I'm sure that on the Series 7 exam and down on Wall Street, they're trying to train ethics. And it could be argued that they're not doing a very good job based on the survey you just, and the candy jar example you just gave us. So how do you train ethics? Are you born with it? Do you get it from your parents? And then pretty much by the time you're 15, it's too late. You either are or you aren't. Do you, like in the Martha Stewart example, live your life and then suddenly when you come into wealth, is that a tipping point for many of us on ethical questions?
Well,
I guess there's two questions in there.
Yeah. And I think there's two sides to the answer. One of them is some people, a British government study issued a white paper a number of years ago, and it concluded that a lot of criminals and a lot of unethical people had been that way since birth. And that's in some ways an astounding comment to make, but they looked into it and that was their conclusion. There are others who become liars, who become wrongdoers. And the question is, how do you prevent them from changing? And one argument I would have is, I think currently ethics texts are terrible. If you go through the leading ethics text, which is called Business Ethics, nowhere is there a succinct consensus or statement of what is unethical. What you get to do is you get to sift through all these case studies. And just in case, John, you ever happen to be in charge of the decision whether to deforest a rainforest in order to give some mining, yes, that will be a useful discussion. Anything short of it is probably irrelevant. So part of the job is crummy teaching has happened. The other part is most people don't realize they can fight unethical. And a really good example is the Baltimore cheerleaders for the Baltimore football team were asked to come down to Guatemala for a team offsite. They showed up and the head of the team said, okay, what we'd like to have is all you cheerleaders go topless. Not standard procedure, I gather, in that team. But after much crying and complaining, they did. And there were other situations they were uncomfortable with, but eventually they all flew back to the United States and nobody complained. Nobody did anything. They were afraid of losing their underpaid, and they are underpaid jobs, and there was no consequences to it. Another team did the same thing. I believe it was Dallas. And when they came back, the cheerleaders sued. And in fact, they walked off with, I think, like several $1 million. So I claim that part of what you do with ethics is you fight it. And you realize, by the way, ethics might fight back. It was just an amusing example. Apparently the Russians hacked the White House computer system a few years ago. And of course, we tried to eradicate them and we rooted out some of their bugs. But apparently as we did it, they were coming in with the next layer of bugs. So it was very difficult to win the battle for the White House computer system. And greed, in this case, speaking Russian, and it's not clear it was a government, but that's what the source was geographically, fought back. So we have an obligation to fight back. By the way,
So,
Sandy,
So the biggest thing I can do is not go read a textbook or wag my finger at my son, but every time I see it, I need to call it out. I need to go report it to my board of realtors. I need to report it to the police. I need to report every bad actor out there if we're going to make any difference.
Yes, it's clearly important to do. And by the way, I think people have, in fact, I think it was Pete who asked, have people moved back from being willing to take a stand, and at the risk of talking about ancient politics, you remember Nelson Rockefeller, who I don't think was corrupt in any way. He had too much money to be corrupt. But when he divorced his wife, he lost huge tracts of support because many of his supporters didn't believe in divorce. Now, you may say that's a very old-fashioned way of looking at it. I mean, I myself think divorce is a legitimate option, but he suffered for it because even though it was perfectly legal, people said, no, that's not the sort of thing I want my candidate to do.
Talking about something with wealth like that, what about generational wealth? Is it unethical to pass your wealth down? Is it greedy or is it ethical?
Good question. What Milton Friedman, by the way, in one of his books talks about exactly that. And he says, let's not forget, it's not the offspring that's making the decision whether to get the wealth, it's the previous generation. And to the extent that they earned that money, either by working or by inheriting it from their grandfathers, they own it, they get to do with it as they like. And if they say, I'm going to go out and buy, 300 cars, or if they say, I'm going to give my son, $300 million, it's their choice in a capitalist society.
And yet billionaires like Bill Gates and Musk and all of them are getting a huge pressure. And this is a new phenomenon in the last couple of decades, huge pressure to give away the bulk of their wealth. That when they get into a certain level of wealth, there's huge pressure that it would be unethical to pass it down to your kids. And this is a new phenomenon.
Well, I mean, the answer is that, Professor Moore says that it's unethical for one person to have huge wealth while another is starving. So for what it's worth, from 1667, from the get-go, the ethical rules were that a huge disparity with one person living in great need is not ethical.
I think the difference is that back then, those people were in the shadow of the people with great wealth. It was almost visible. So the disparity was visible, whereas now the populations are so widespread that Bill Gates does not see someone starving on the other side of the world, neither does Elon Musk. So they're giving back. And I think the other is that the level of outrage that people feel is usually commensurate with the level of wealth that people have achieved. There might be somebody in Indiana that leaves their tractor collection to their grandson, which may have a value, but not the value of Gates or Musk. And is that any worse? I don't think so.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because you're right, there's a perception thing. And what was very interesting was that during the Great Depression, there were all sorts of signs that America was in danger of having its government toppled. There was the Million Man, or whatever it was, March on Washington by the unemployed, and you actually had communists who got elected in Minnesota to the state government. And that scared, if you read some of the histories, that scared the wealthy into becoming a lot more modest in how they exhibit their wealth. That got lost over time. So now you hear these are ridiculous expenditures, like, oh yeah, I think I'll have my own private spaceship program, or something else that is just clearly excessive. And yeah, be warned. That's all I can say. And that is, again, something that makes clear that there is an inequality. While some are starving, some are spending billions on amusements.
So for those of us who are feeling bad 58 minutes into the hour, can you give us an uplifting conclusion? Is there hope for society? Is there a happy ending to all this, Doctors?
I think there is. I think a lot of it is that we must be careful of observing what we're seeing, and that will allow us to avoid it. And what's interesting is Professor Moore he said somewhere in the book, it says, what are sort of things you can do to observe someone who is greedy? And he says, be warned for you can know that someone is trustworthy if there's two characteristics you see. One of them is, are they grateful? Greedy people tend not to be grateful. The second one is, and this is interesting, it certainly caught me by surprise, do they have a sense of humor? Greedy people generally don't have a sense of humor. They may have malicious joy in something, they may have many things, but not a sense of humor. So the short answer is, if you're dealing with someone and you doubt them, ask yourself, are they exhibiting either of those two characteristics? And if the answer is no, then be very suspicious and very cautious.
I love that.
Great advice.
That's useful. I need to hang out with people who have a good sense of humor and who are grateful.
After 58 minutes, he finally gave him something useful. Yes.
I got it. That's great. Who did you write this book for? Did you write this book for the Wall Street crowd, the realtors? Who did you write this book for?
In some ways, I wrote it for my generation, because my generation has a lot to blame, by the way. I mean, if you look at it, I'm sorry to say that, but we have been very bad at being a good steward of the public trust. Two of our presidents, among the worst presidents of all time, George Bush, Donald Trump, some others have done pretty poorly. And there's just a lot of ways in which our generation, my generation, I think you're younger, have failed to live up to their obligations. And some of it is because they don't realize they have the obligation, and they don't realize what is wrong. Again, because we haven't taught ethics in very crisp fashion that Professor Moore laid it out in. And that's why I have an appendix with part of his book in the back of my book.
No, I think it's an excellent start. I think it starts with the book. It continues with a conversation like we're having now. And with conversations around ethics, I think it will all at least begin to turn it over in our heads, and we'll begin to be a little bit more sensitive when we see it, when we see bad behavior. And you've told us what we have to do is when we see bad behavior, we have to call it out. That every one of us is a policeman for ethical behavior.
Yeah, not stupidly call it out, but push the levers. Like, for instance, there's a story that got pulled out of LinkedIn in my book where somebody called out something in his company and was shortly thereafter fired, because it turned out too much of management was invested in the unethical behavior. So, people have to be smart about it, but they do have to be proactive.
I like that. That's a good way to end. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you,
This
Doctor.
was a great
Thank
hour.
you, everyone.
Everybody,
I enjoyed this thoroughly.
Ethics and Hidden Greed. Can you see? It's very, very interesting. I've really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I'm delighted.
excellent book. Thank you very much, and hope to see you again on the show soon.
Hope to be it.
And with that, signing off from Iceland. Thank you, Roberto.
Get back safely, my friend. Get back safely. Did everybody notice John doesn't have his propeller on today? Look how handsome he looks.
I might have to do this more often, Roberto.
That's right.
All right.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.